While headlines from Moscow claim that Ukraine's defenses are on the verge of collapse and that the capture of all of Donbass is just around the corner, a far more complex and sobering picture is emerging from the battlefield. In this video, we break down an in-depth assessment by Institute for the Study of War analysts Jessica Sobieski and Jenny Olmsted, who argue that Russia is nowhere near a decisive breakthrough and may not be able to seize all of Donetsk until 2027 or even 2028. We'll look at what Russia can realistically achieve by the end of 2025, why battles around Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, and Huliapol matter so much, how drones and logistics warfare are reshaping the front, and what risks Ukraine faces in 2026. Finally, we'll examine whether the Kremlin is genuinely preparing for peace or simply betting on a long war of attrition and Western fatigue. Despite the increasingly confident rhetoric coming out of Moscow, the reality on the ground suggests that Russia's military campaign in eastern Ukraine remains slow, costly, and far from decisive. By the end of 2025, Russian forces may be able to complete their long-running, 22-month effort to seize Pokrovsk and close the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd pocket, but even this achievement would fall well short of the strategic breakthrough that Kremlin officials continue to imply. Since mid-October and early November 2025, Russian troops have poured massive amounts of manpower and equipment into this sector, attempting not only to capture Pokrovsk itself but also to encircle Ukrainian forces in the surrounding pocket. Yet, as of late 2025, they have still not fully succeeded, highlighting the structural limits of Russia's offensive capacity. Even if Pokrovsk does fall by the end of the year, its capture would be more symbolic than transformative. Ukraine had already been forced to reduce its reliance on Pokrovsk as a key logistics hub by July 2025 due to sustained Russian pressure and interdiction. In that sense, the town's final seizure would amount to what military analysts describe as a tactical Pyrrhic victory. Russia would gain ground on the map, but without the operational payoff needed to collapse Ukrainian defenses across the Donetsk region. This pattern, high expenditure for limited gains, has become a defining feature of Russia's campaign. At the same time, Moscow appears to be using the final weeks of 2025 to prepare the battlefield for much harder fights in 2026. In Donetsk region, Russian forces are setting conditions for future assaults on Kostiantynivka, the southernmost city of Ukraine's so-called fortress belt. This defensive line, running north-south along the H-20 highway toward Sloviansk, has resisted Russian attempts at penetration since 2014. Notably, Russian troops began infiltrating parts of Kostiantynivka as early as late September 2025, adopting new tactics that emphasize bypassing fortified Ukrainian strongpoints rather than smashing into them head-on. Small assault groups infiltrate behind Ukrainian lines, gradually building combat power before launching localized attacks, a method born out of Russia's repeated failures in traditional frontal assaults, including its unsuccessful push toward Pokrovsk in March 2024. These tactics have yielded marginal gains in eastern Kostiantynivka, but the broader picture remains unfavorable for Moscow. Seizing a heavily fortified urban center like Kostiantynivka would require sustained resources, time, and manpower on a scale that Russia has struggled to maintain without incurring extreme casualties. According to ISW analysts, even under optimistic assumptions for Russia, and assuming Western support for Ukraine continues, Russian forces are unlikely to capture the entirety of Donetsk and break the fortress belt before 2027 or 2028. A similar story is unfolding farther south in Zaporizhzhia region. Since mid-October 2025, Russian forces have pushed closer to Huliapol, advancing southwest of Velikomichailivka and pressing north and northeast of the town. While these moves have improved Russia's tactical positioning, they are unlikely to result in the capture of Huliapol before the end of 2025. Instead, Moscow's goal appears to be setting the conditions for a gradual envelopment of the settlement, mirroring the slow, grinding approach now seen in Kostiantynivka. The eventual fall of Pokrovsk, if and when it occurs, will mark a transition point rather than a turning point in the war. Contrary to alarmist narratives, the loss of the city will not immediately unravel Ukraine's defenses across the Donetsk region. The war at this stage is deeply positional, and Ukrainian forces have spent years constructing layered field fortifications, exploiting rivers, urban terrain, and natural obstacles west of Pokrovsk. These defenses are specifically designed to absorb pressure, trade space for time, and prevent the kind of rapid operational breakthrough that Russian commanders have repeatedly failed to achieve since 2022. However, the real danger for Ukraine lies not in the symbolic loss of Pokrovsk itself, but in what that loss frees up for the Russian military. Throughout 2025, Russia has tied down enormous combat power in this single sector. At least two combined arms armies, the 51st Combined Arms Army, formerly associated with the so-called Donetsk People's Republic under the Southern Military District, and the 2nd Combined Arms Army from the Central Military District, have been heavily committed to the Pokrovsk-Myrnorad pocket. The 2nd CAA has focused on fighting inside the pocket, while the 51st CAA has split its efforts between closing the pocket from the north and pushing toward Dobropilya to the northwest. This concentration has come at a cost for Russia elsewhere. By committing so much manpower and material to Pokrovsk, Moscow has limited its ability to pursue decisive advances simultaneously in other strategically important directions, including Huliapol, eastern Zaporizhia, and even parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Once Pokrovsk is no longer contested, Russian commanders will gain the flexibility to redeploy surviving elements of these formations to new axes of advance. That redeployment, however, will not be immediate. Russian units have suffered heavy casualties during the prolonged campaign, and many formations will require time to rest, refit, and absorb replacements before they can be used effectively again. This dynamic underscores a recurring theme of the war. Russian advances often generate new opportunities on paper, but those opportunities are constrained by exhaustion, losses, and logistical strain. If redeployed northward, Russian forces could reinforce pressure against the fortress belt, particularly around Kostiantynivka, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk. If sent south, they could strengthen efforts to break Ukrainian defenses in Zaporizhia and threaten deeper approaches toward Dnipropetrovsk. Each option carries trade-offs, and attempting all of them simultaneously risks repeating the overextension that has plagued Russian operations since the early months of the invasion. The recent Russian advances in Zaporizhia and parts of Dnipropetrovsk help explain why this sector has become increasingly dangerous for Ukraine. Unlike other areas of the front, Russian command appears to have deliberately prioritized the Huliapol direction, concentrating elements of at least 3 combined arms armies and an airborne division. Units from the 35th, 5th, 36th, and 29th Combined Arms Armies, along with the 76th Airborne Division, were gradually redeployed from other sectors, including Sumy and the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya area, over several months. This massing of force mirrors, in scale, the concentration previously seen around Pokrovsk. Russia also exploited favorable conditions. Ukrainian defenses in parts of Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk were thinner, foggy autumn weather reduced the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones, and the open rural terrain west of Uspinivka made defensive positions harder to hold. As a result, Russian troops achieved a relatively rapid advance of roughly 17 kilometers toward the Haicha River, significant by the standards of this war. Yet even here, the limits of Russian momentum quickly became apparent. Once Russian units reached the river, their advance slowed sharply, and they now faced the difficult task of forcing a crossing under Ukrainian fire. From a political and strategic perspective, these developments reveal Moscow's core dilemma. Russia can still generate localized breakthroughs by concentrating force, exploiting weather, and accepting high casualties. But every such effort drains resources from elsewhere and deepens dependence on the assumption that Ukraine will eventually run out of men, ammunition, or Western support. In my assessment, the Kremlin's strategy increasingly resembles a high-stakes gamble, trading long-term sustainability for short-term territorial gains, while hoping that pressure on multiple fronts will eventually fracture Ukraine's defense. Whether that gamble pays off depends less on Russia's battlefield ingenuity and more on whether Ukraine and its partners can adapt faster to the evolving character of the war. Looking ahead to 2026, the trajectory of the war points toward a prolonged and punishing contest centered on Ukraine's remaining strongholds in Donetsk and the broader question of strategic endurance. Russian forces are likely to focus their main effort on Ukraine's fortress belt, a defensive system anchored by large, heavily fortified cities such as Kostiantynivka, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk. Recent Russian infiltrations around Lyman and Siversk are best understood as preparatory moves, aimed at setting conditions for future offensives against the northern edge of this defensive line. To threaten Sloviansk from the northeast or east, Russia would need to fully seize these towns, cross major waterways like the Siversky Donetsk River, and sustain offensive pressure over months, if not years. At the same time, Moscow may attempt to apply pressure on the southern portion of the fortress belt through continued fighting in and around Konstantinivka, while maintaining opportunistic advances in the Huliapol direction. This multi-axis approach allows Russia to preserve the strategic initiative and force Ukraine to defend everywhere at once. Yet it also exposes a fundamental weakness. Russia has repeatedly struggled to conduct large-scale, simultaneous offensives without exhausting its forces. Even if units freed up after Pokrovsk are redeployed, they will likely require significant time to recover from heavy losses before they can meaningfully influence new sectors of the front. The evolving character of warfare is perhaps the most important variable shaping these prospects. Russia's recent gains have been driven less by maneuver warfare and more by a new operational template centered on drone-enabled battlefield air interdiction. By systematically targeting Ukrainian ground lines of communication at operational depths, often 30 to 120 kilometers behind the front line, Russian forces have degraded Ukrainian logistics, slowed resupply, and complicated frontline defense. This approach has allowed Russian infantry to attack Ukrainian positions after months of shaping operations, rather than through costly, immediate frontal assaults. Ukraine, for its part, has not yet fully neutralized this threat. Limited drone detection, interception capabilities, and shortages of manpower, artillery, and equipment have created vulnerabilities that Russian forces continue to exploit. Bad weather further complicates Ukrainian reliance on drones, while shortages in traditional systems reduce flexibility when drone operations are disrupted. Still, Ukraine has begun to respond in kind. In areas like the Pokrovsk direction, Ukrainian forces have launched their own strikes against Russian near-rear logistics, demonstrating the potential to mirror Russia's interdiction strategy. With sufficient Western support, particularly in the production of mid-range strike systems, Ukraine could expand these efforts and push Russian assembly areas farther from the front, blunting future offensives. When viewed through a longer-term lens, the pace of Russian advance remains revealing. Even during its intensified push in the fall of 2025, Russian forces advanced at an average rate of roughly 9.3 square kilometers per day, a faster tempo than earlier in the year, but still slow by any historical standard. At that pace, and assuming consistent Western support for Ukraine and resilient Ukrainian defenses, Russian forces would not fully seize the remaining approximately 22% of Ukrainian-held Donetsk region until at least August 2027. In reality, the timeline is likely longer. Seasonal weather advantages fade, urban strongholds loom ahead, and the drone-dominated battlefield severely limits the kind of operational maneuver Russia would need to achieve a rapid collapse of Ukrainian defenses. This military reality intersects directly with the political endgame. Despite periodic talk of negotiations, the Kremlin continues to signal that it is not prepared for a genuine peace settlement. Russian President Vladimir Putin and senior officials persistently frame the war in maximalist terms, openly questioning Ukrainian sovereignty and referring to cities such as Odessa as inherently Russian. The Kremlin's vague invocation of root causes serves as shorthand for demands that would effectively reduce Ukraine to a subordinate or de facto Russian-controlled entity, terms fundamentally incompatible with Ukraine's survival as an independent state. Putin's theory of victory rests on attrition and Western fatigue, the belief that Russia can sustain slow, incremental advances indefinitely while preventing Ukraine from mounting successful counteroffensives, eventually outlasting Kyiv's resources and political support from abroad. Yet this theory faces serious obstacles. Russia still must overcome Ukraine's fortress belt, cross major rivers such as the Dnipro, manage mounting economic and demographic pressures, and absorb extraordinarily high casualty rates. None of these challenges are trivial, and together they cast doubt on Russia's ability to achieve its objectives through military means alone. In my view, the war's continuation is less a sign of Russian confidence than of strategic rigidity. Moscow has boxed itself into a position where compromise is politically dangerous at home, yet total victory remains elusive on the battlefield. As long as Ukrainians remain willing to defend their country and Western states continue to link Ukrainian sovereignty to their own security, Russia's path to victory remains narrow and uncertain. The coming years, therefore, are likely to be defined not by decisive breakthroughs, but by a grinding contest of adaptation, endurance, and political will, one in which time, contrary to Kremlin hopes, may not be working in Russia's favor.